Unrestricted Warfare. The Chinese Communist Party's ultimate goal, which even the most powerful and well-connected are clueless of or complicit in, is to strengthen itself at every turn. The CCP believes that its biggest obstacle, and indeed its greatest threat, is the United States of America, in as much as it remains the global economic and military leader. The party's goal and biggest challenge is to displace America's position on the world stage. The CCP's own documents state as much. Perhaps the most important and revealing of these documents is a 1999 work called Unrestricted Warfare, written by two senior colonels in China's People's Liberation Army, PLA, Qiao Liang and Wang Xiangsui. It outlined a number of strategies to tilt the balance of power throughout the globe in China's favor. It should be required reading for all branches of the U.S. government and for business leaders, because it outlines in no uncertain terms the strategy behind China's policies in the world. Here is a short, chilling passage. The new principles of war are no longer using armed force to compel the enemy to submit to one's will, but rather are using all means, including armed force or non-armed force, military and non-military, and lethal and non-lethal means to compel the enemy to accept one's interests. Unrestricted warfare is not fun, light reading. It is dense, complex reading material that combines strategy and economics, social theory, and trenchant observations on technology. It is, however, brilliant and arguably the most important philosophical and strategic book about warfare of our generation. It was first published in China and widely read within the CCP. Among modern-day China scholars, it is well known. But perhaps because of its strange complexity, the West has failed to connect its strategic musing with China's often misleadingly benign and smiling diplomacy. What the CCP realized and what unrestricted warfare lays out is that a nation no longer needs a vast army in order to conquer, to control another country's population, its resources, or its government. Military might is only one way to express aggression, only one of many ways to attain power. In China's view, economic power strengthens all the fields of potential engagement. In other words, money bolsters the military, but it also bolsters every other sphere of engagement imaginable. It can be used to influence and sway political leaders in foreign countries, silence ideas, and purchase or steal technology. It can be used to manufacture goods at dirt cheap prices and drive competitors out of business or weaken rival economies. It can be used to create an army of academics who fan out to gather scientific, technological, and engineering intelligence that can be used to further other goals. It becomes clear, viewed from the calculating perspective of unrestricted warfare, that our leaders failed to understand that CCP leaders are merely paying lip service to free trade and globalization while blatantly ignoring the laws governing free trade. China welcomes investment, but it won't let investors take their profit out of the country. Chinese companies set up shop all around the world, but the totalitarian CCP puts all kinds of limits on foreign companies growing in China. Since the end of the Cold War, leaders in the West have operated under an economic theory that free markets lead to great wealth. This concept has merged with something called the theory of modernization, a sociological idea asserting that democracy is the direct result of economic growth. As Seymour Lipset, one of the proponents of this theory, put it, the more well-to-do a nation, the greater the chances that it will sustain democracy. In other words, free trade leads to wealth, and wealth leads to democracy. This is the idea behind Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. And it was the theory that led America's elites to partner with the Chinese Communist Party. See, America's elite understood the power of the world order created by Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a document that still serves as the template for that order as we know it, the Atlantic Charter, all of one page, lays out the principles that would govern international behavior for the next 70-plus years and underpin other well-known institutions like the United Nations and the WTO. While the Charter has 8 paragraphs, there are essentially 4 principles that govern the international system. 1. Free markets. 2. Democratic principles. 3. Rule of law. And 4. Self-determination. It was these 4 principles that America's elites believed would lead to China's eventual democratization. Unfortunately, Lipset and so many others in the West failed to understand the intractable nature of the totalitarian Chinese Communist Party, which regards democracy as a fundamental threat to its existence and figured out a way to game the free market system. The CCP believed that it could turn the tables on the West by convincing Western leaders that it agreed with the principles of the world order while systematically working to undermine them all. In 2017, when Chinese President Xi Jinping went to the annual World Economic Forum, the epicenter of globalization in Davos, Switzerland, he said, "We must remain committed to developing global free trade and investment, promote trade and investment liberalization and facilitation through opening up, and say no to protectionism." It sounds like he is adopting the West point of view, but here is where the CCP turns the tables and why its influence is so subtle, cutting, and effective. Let me explain. In aerial combat, pilots talk about creating a shared mental model with the other aircraft crew members. This allows for perfect choreography when communication is not possible in a combat environment. In order to achieve a shared mental model, it is not sufficient to just understand the words. Our intent, what we want to achieve, and how we are going to react to make our plans a reality must be crystal clear. In Davos, the audience heard words coming out of Xi's mouth, but they did not hear or understand Xi's ultimate intent. They believed that Xi's words means that he agreed to the underlying principles of globalization, and that is what he wanted them to hear. But when one passes what he actually said and what was left unsaid, it becomes clear Xi offered no firm commitment to anything. There is no mention of adhering to international law, no mention of changing monetary policy to a law for the free flow of earnings out of China. To whom is Xi saying no to protectionism? Not China. Everything about economic policy in China is protectionist. He is saying the West should not be protectionist because that serves CCP goals. So, in fact, the leader of China was subtly undermining the laws of free trade and globalization while appearing to agree with them. Xi and the CCP have crafted a shrewd strategy, and they have had perfect unwitting allies in their scheme, America's elites. By now, you've probably guessed what happens in a real combat when the team doesn't share the correct mental model: chaos. The same can be said for the world order that exists today, and that's the reason for this book. What Xi was actually saying at Davos was that he needed the West to stay open for business. While he was professing agreement with prevailing Western economic and social theory, he was actually operating on CCP theory. Instead of free trade leading to wealth and wealth leading to democracy, his mental model said globalization and the internet enabled the CCP to gain power at the West's expense. By accessing Western money to fund China's economic, military, and technological growth, and thereby increasing his nation's power and influence across the globe. By hijacking the mental model of America's elites, by selling them a fraudulent dream of free trade on a level playing field, Xi could essentially co-opt them, luring them into a game of subterfuge. More important, since the CCP controls China's purse strings, he could set the incentives so that his allies got rich supporting China's power grab. It is in essence the perfect strategy. Promise your enemy short-term profits and enlist them to help make your country the most powerful in the world. America's elites have been jumping at a chance to join the bandwagon for over 40 years, as if it were a dream come true. Get rich while making the world safe for democracy. Fortunately, one thing was standing in the way: the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees our citizens' freedoms, including the right to vote, a concept the totalitarian CCP can never imagine. The 3.4 million Americans unemployed by China's Great Game, along with many of their families and friends, decided they had had enough. Economic and social theory be damned. They were going to make their voice heard. And some of our leaders heard them. We saw this begin to play out in the 2016 national election, as candidates from both sides of the political spectrum, Democrat Bernie Sanders and Republican Donald Trump, began speaking to those who who have been abandoned and victimized by unfair free trade, the China shock to our economy. We also saw this in the 2018 midterm elections, as politicians adopted platforms that called for providing more support, higher minimum wages, improved health care for those abandoned as their jobs were taken overseas. This book is for and about the men and women of America who yearn for the better life they had before their elites welcomed their enemy into the WTO and into their lives. The following chapters tell the story about where their country has gone wrong and how to get it back on track. And yes, that story is about China's sales war, the manipulation and dumping of America's elites. While hugely important, is only one aspect of multi-pronged, relentless offensive, but it is also about America winning that war, about forming a more perfect union, establishing justice, and ensuring domestic tranquility, about providing for the common defense and promoting the general welfare. Mostly, though, it's about preventing a dystopian future and securing the blessings of liberty for ourselves and for generations to come. The fact is, we have about 3 years to stop the CCP's unrestricted war. If we don't, the ideals of liberty that have shaped America, our defining concepts of freedom and independence, will face almost certain destruction at the hands of a totalitarian government that values nothing more than its own power. The power is targeting our country in ways that affect everyone at every level. When China succeeds in learning U.S. investment dollars, those are dollars that are not being invested domestically. That is capital that is leaving America that could have been invested in America, that could have been used to generate jobs here. When a Chinese company pirates an electronic device developed in the United States by an American company and then sells that knockoff device, it is stealing income from the company that invested in creating the device. That loss of income has further repercussions, which can translate into loss of jobs, loss of tax revenue, and loss of future earnings. The CCP's action and inactions don't just hurt a corporation or a manufacturer. They are attacks on our society as a whole. The average American citizen needs to understand this.